Welcome to Inside the Set with Set Decor. Inside the Set is a series that focuses on the design and decor of stories that excite us and ignite our imaginations, where we get to discuss the collaborations between production designers and set decorators, and hear firsthand accounts of how those works of art came to be, from their inception to ideas on a page through completion, where we sit in the dark and experience them collectively.
Welcome to Inside the Set with Set Decor. I'm Serdena SDSA, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm pleased to welcome production designers Andrew L. Jones and Doug Chiang and set decorator Amanda Moss Serino, SDSA, to discuss their creative collaboration on The Mandalorian, now streaming on Disney+. Amanda, Doug, Andrew, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. This is terrific.
Thank you very much.
I'm so excited to have you guys here. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I feel like I'm here with the OGs from Lucasfilm's first live streaming show, and it's really exciting. I'm going to start with a question for Doug. Doug, you've been involved with Lucasfilms for a long time. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you came to Mandalorian and what that experience has been like.
Yeah, no, obviously, I grew up being a huge fan of the original trilogy. I mean, that was why I got into film design. And so I was 15 years old when I saw that. And I've been, really angling to be a film designer and work with George Lucas on Star Wars forever. And I've really, finally got that opportunity in 1995 when George started the prequels. And I was fortunate enough to be hired to, head up the art department. So I've been working on Star Wars now for easily over 25 years. And so it's been terrific. And the really wonderful thing about all this is that when I was working with George, he had always had this master design plan, because if, the casual fan may think of Star Wars as the prequel trilogy and the original trilogy, but it's one big 6-film series. And the design that's actually flows through the whole 6 episodes. And there's a logic to it. And the great thing is that we never really had an opportunity to actually highlight that or feature that until we actually started to work with Jon Favreau on the Mandalorian series, because the Mandalorian takes place about 7 to 9 years after Return of the Jedi. And it gave us a really wonderful opportunity to now bridge all those 6 films together in terms of the aesthetics, bringing designs from the prequel era to the original trilogy into the Mandalorian. And so the fun for me right now is that we really have sort of this ability to sort of design and create this cohesive universe that George Lucas always intended under Jon Favreau's and Dave Filoni's guidance.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is definitely an aesthetic through line that it's like kind of like you know it and not necessarily consciously, but it's like there is a Star Wars aesthetic. And Andrew, maybe you can talk a little bit about joining the team and what that experience has been like, and also particularly some of the new technologies that were introduced on this show and how they may have influenced your work.
Absolutely. I was lucky enough to work with Doug all the way back on Polar Express and several films in between. So we had a relationship there already, which was marvelous. So I was really thrilled to get the chance to work on this show with Doug and with John, who I'd worked before, and Amanda. Amanda and I both worked with John on Jungle Book. And I think, Amanda, we'd worked together before as well. So it was a sort of happy collaboration right there. I'm also a fan and saw the original trilogy starting when I was 15, and so I've always adored this storyline, and working with Doug has been a real treat because he's the sort of guru of this, and I'm learning still every project we do, and this latest season is really quite a big one, quite a challenge. And yeah, we do have some interesting new technologies that we're employing. You may have heard of the virtual production technology, the LED volume that we're using, which is added a layer of interest to the project. And we're sort of 3 seasons into learning how to use that. And that's been a real challenge, but also a real thrill to sort of figure it out and find out how it works. Certainly for production design, and I'm sure Amanda will tell you it's been an interesting route for her as well.
I'm wondering if any of you might be willing to give our audience just sort of a very brief tutorial of what the volume is. I mean, it's a really interesting experience for anyone that's not familiar with it.
I can have a stab at that. I like to think of it a little bit like a scenic backdrop that you would have gotten in the golden age of cinema, painted backdrop that Hitchcock would have used, for example. It's just extending the environment off into the distance, and it's taking into consideration where the camera is, where the story is taking place. It's just that this is a very sophisticated version of that, where the camera is being tracked so that as the camera moves, you're seeing parallax in the background, which opens it up to being shot in a number of ways, whereas a painted backdrop has got a very limited field of view that it can work. This can be in any direction, any speed, and any move. That's really the crux of it right there. It's a whole science project besides that, but what it is not is just a backdrop that you can shoot a film against. It really requires you to be building sets for the performance to interact with, and then integrating it with this virtual world that you're seeing on the LED wall. And to get that whole system to work has required a bit of a rethink of our entire process and opened up new possibilities. We create the whole world in a game engine that allows us to go in and scout and decide how we're going to shoot a film very early on. And it's created a very new approach, which is still developing, especially on our show. Just a bit of history. John was kind of heading towards this technology anyway in his trajectory from the Jungle Book, which was using very small scenic sets which moved around in front of a blue screen. Lion King, where he developed virtual production technology where the camera work was all done virtually, and then incorporating all of that with the LED screen in The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian was, of course, a perfect use case because our lead character is basically a shiny silver sphere, and so is reflecting the entire environment. But that perfect use case gave us a little bit of license when we first started out, but we've expanded the possibilities of that.
And to add to that, I think one of the really terrific advantages of having the LED volume on the day when we're shooting is that we have all that content for the actors to react to. It's interesting because, Star Wars is a lot about spectacle and scope. And so sometimes, when we design these vast worlds, it's almost impossible to realize them except in post-production. But yet you have to have them up in pre-production and principal photography for the actors and the cinematographers to actually frame the shots. And that was one of the biggest frustrations during this whole thing, is that when you think about the Star Wars films, George Lucas was always trying to push the technology of filmmaking to make it more efficient. And he was always frustrated, so when we made that transition into the digital era, we had a lot of blue screen. And that was the biggest complaint from the actors, was that, we had all the environments designed, but we couldn't realize it on the day. And it was just nothing but a sea of blue or green screen. And it was super frustrating. But on the monitors, we actually had real-time comping. So the directors could see, a sort of a very crude facsimile of what the environment could look like. So they could actually kind of, compose the shots that they needed. But the frustration was that no one else could see that. And so the wonderful thing about the LED volume is that we now have a real-time rendered content that is at a fidelity that's high enough that we can actually project it so that it looks like you're actually walking into the set of this real fantastic environment. And there's nothing to guess. The cinematographer can actually frame it up perfectly. He can compose it just right, adjust the lighting, and it's all there. And our goal is to really capture as much of that in camera as possible, so it feels really authentic. Because one of the dangers of sort of creating spectacle like this, when you're creating sort of fantastic worlds that's rooted in reality, is that it may not look real, and you won't know that until the end. And so we try to solve all those problems up front, and then demands a great deal of work, between myself, Andrew, and Amanda, to have all those things figured out so that we can create a virtual, content version of the actual physical props and sets.
That's fantastic. I love those explanations. I'm going to have to remember that if anybody ever asks me. Okay, Amanda, I mean, my hat's off to you. I have so much respect for all the fine work that you've done on this show and others. First, I'm going to fanboy for a second, and I'm just going to go, how thrilling must it have been to have gotten the call to say, hey, how'd you like to come work on Star Wars?
It was pretty amazing. Like Andrew said, we had worked together in the past, and I was actually in Atlanta working on Godzilla when he called, and we weren't quite sure what it was. It was, Amanda, I've got this. It's going to be a little bit of a new technology. We're going to try something out. So at the beginning, it wasn't so much the sell of Star Wars as we were like, okay, we're trying this new environment. We're going to see how this works. So it wasn't until I came into the offices to meet Doug that I think it really sunk in that I'm interviewing to go work on Star Wars. So it took a minute before that to be like, wait a minute. And Doug's question was, you like Star Wars, right? And I'm like, I am a fan. And that's when I was like, oh, right, here we are.
That's cool. Maybe you can, since the technology was so new when you came on board, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the experience of that learning curve was like in terms of being able to figure out, how do I do the things that I've spent years cultivating a sort of process on projects? How do I translate that into this realm? I'm just curious how you experience that.
It would be interesting to have asked me that question after season 1, when so much of that was, because I literally had no idea. You know, we were in the offices trying to work with the game engine, trying to design the sets in the computer, which we've done in the past as a tool, you know, as you kind of do your 3D sets, but not to this extent. And each day was a learning curve as we're trying to be like, okay, wait a minute, now, you know, my fabrics have to match, or we really are going to have to recreate this item so you can scan it and put it in. And at that point, we were still testing how to scan. You know, we were just renting things from prop houses. We were checking to see how fabric would work. And it was like film school. Like, we really did not know what was happening. And little by little, you learn, and then you understand how to use the tool, and then you try it again. So now that we're 3 seasons in, I almost forget what that first approach was, because again, you don't know what you don't know. Mm-hmm. And now we've learned. And now to me, it's an amazing tool. And I keep joking to my crew, I'm like, I don't know how we're going to go back and do a normal job that doesn't have this technology, because even the way we decorate the sets, because we have to decorate the volume, or what's on, you know, on the volume, we now have a full vision way in advance of what that is, what our overall look is going to be. And it's just been such an amazing tool to work with.
So maybe, Amanda, also you could just help our viewers understand that you have responsibilities not only for the physical set that is inside of the volume, but some of the responsibilities that you have for the content that is on the walls.
As Doug and Andrew design the overall environments, and that again has kind of been a great process, because you're on early. The prep of something like a show like this is, you have to know what you're doing so early on. So to watch them all go through with Jon Favreau and Dave, and look at the artwork that Doug's creating, and kind of get the whole story, starts there. Then it kind of trickles down to how we're going to actually do it. And then you're looking at, all right, what's the environment that we're creating in the volume that we're going to put on the backdrop, and how do we make the practical items, the real set that we're building, connect to that environment? Because one of the big keys that we've learned along the way is there has to be connective tissue. Like when we were just looking at the volume that we had up, where we had it was the landscape set. If you notice, part of those boat awnings or boat sails are fabric, they're practical, and the rest of them are digital. So there was a fine line of making sure that our colors match, our aging matches, that line is as seamless as it could be.
Yeah, and I would like to add, I mean, I think it's, the difference with the workflow that we developed for the Mandalorian is terrific because we have somebody with the talent and skill of Amanda going all the way through and making sure that the set decoration is spot on. Because typically in a lot of these sort of big tentpole like films, a lot of that is left in post with the post-production houses. And so a lot of that information that's figured out in the beginning is lost in that translation when we're in that 18-month of post-production. And it's a little bit of a frustration because then we're actually trying to create these environments, trying to sort of fulfill sort of Amanda's role with digital artists. And they don't have the same experience. And I found that so often that where we're trying to create these sets now that, once we have the elements shot, we're piecing it all together in post-production. And it's just not meeting the high bar that we want. And what's great about The Mandalorian is that all that is brought up front so that Amanda is in there every step of the way. So she's giving all the visual effects artists exactly the prop, the placement, the material, the look. And that fidelity actually goes all the way through the whole pipeline now. And I think that's what makes it very, different for us is that we have that level of quality because all that homework, all that knowledge in the beginning is not lost till the very end.
Yeah, it just adds so many layers of richness to the experience that the viewer's having. And I mean, I think it is a major contributor to the level of excitement that people have about watching this series. It's kind of like the experience of being immersed in these worlds. And I just really have to commend all of you for the excellent job that you do. Doug, I am curious, there's something so interesting about the experience of watching Star Wars. It's kind of like there's a familiarity to it, and yet it is its own unique thing. And so, I mean, I feel like there are some maybe cultural, architectural touchstones that serve as inspiration for you when you're conceiving of some of these environments. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those influences and how they might have come to play in some of the Mandalorian sets.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about the universe, the Star Wars universe that George created, is that it's not really our reality, but 80% of it is grounded in our reality. And the curious thing that I found out, when I started working with George was that he has his own sort of distinct internal logic for storytelling. And they're not always scientific and they're not always logical. I mean, for example, like the technology is really rooted in the 1970s and 80s, so you have, CRT monitors, classic, keyboards, cables. But then on top of that, you have exotic technology like holograms and levitation. And so it's this weird thing where George developed this, he kind of came up with the rules for what he needed for storytelling. And those rules apply to the designs as well. And so designs actually have their own internal logic that doesn't always make sense, but it actually makes sense for Star Wars. For example, there's the classic thing of no zippers or buttons on clothing in Star Wars. And that oddity is what makes Star Wars look familiar, but feel different. And it's this curious thing where, that's why George had the Star Wars universe, put in a galaxy far, far away and a long time ago. That was very specific. And what you gain from that is you get all the sort of the foundation of something that's very familiar, but you're seeing it in a new context. And so the fun that we have now in designing sort of the Mandalorian series and all our feature films is that we're leaning into that. So Star Wars has this very distinct look, which I think is very unique in the sense that there were rules designed by George, but they're unique in the sense that it feels familiar, but it looks different, but it's grounded in reality. And so a lot of the homework that myself, Andrew, and Amanda do, we do a lot of research, to make sure that everything makes sense. And then maybe Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni will just cherry pick the 5% that will end up on the screen. But all that history, all that sort of background that we do on whatever it is, whatever the set is, whatever the set decoration is, whatever the lighting is, it's all there. So we can sit down and dissect the scene and tell you exactly why this material looks like this and why it's there and why the forms of this way. And I think that logic, that homework comes through to the audience. They may not know it, implicitly, but they can feel it. And I love that idea where you're building this very authentic world because George never considered Star Wars a science fiction fantasy film. He always considered it like a period film, a historical drama. And if you look at it and approach it that way, it actually makes our jobs a lot easier because now we kind of know where we're grounding it.
It's a really interesting tension between like high and low in terms of like technologies and aesthetics. And you guys pull that off magnificently. I'm curious, Andrew, what are some of the secrets to keeping things grounded in the Star Wars universe? how do you observe certain guardrails for that?
We've got an amazing construction department and really first-rate artisans, and they're able to create, for example, our plaster form and Rob Wilbanks will be able to create a stone material, a travertine, a granite, something like that, very beautifully, or a sort of aged plaster wall. But we're using these materials that visually we know kind of what they are, but then they're being used in shapes and forms that are coming from Doug and Doug's team that are in these shapes that are evocative of Star Wars. So, and then the paint department and the sculpting department, they're all so tremendously skilled at making these materials that we're familiar with, but then making them into these extraordinary shapes and architectural forms and vehicular forms. So I think there's a lot of that. We also, and into Amanda's world a little bit here, we also are not afraid to take ready-made materials and incorporate those, as long as you're not, it's not sticking out. There's a lot of realism you get by using existing pipes and fixtures and tiles and so forth that we're building the sets with, but then respecting the vision that's coming from the concept team and really using them to make this look that's been established in Star Wars.
I'd like to add to that. I mean, I think Amanda really is amazing in the sense that sometimes we'll kickstart the design, because we actually, have to create these keyframes in order to get the concept design, approved by Jon Favreau. And so we'll have placeholders for some of the set decoration. They're kind of in the right idea. They have the right Star Wars look, but they're by no means real. And when I pass that over to Amanda, I mean, it's always terrific to see what she does with that, because it becomes something even more spectacular. And set decoration for Star Wars is what defines Star Wars. It's that used universe. And those little details make a huge difference, because, if you don't get those little details right, it can easily turn it into another genre or another film or something else. And so I love the idea that Amanda does all that research and all that homework to get it just right.
Well, it's interesting because my own experience of watching the show is, the sort of thing that might typically throw me off in any kind of designed environment is when something really is glaring and draws attention to itself in a way that I find distracting. And one of the things that's fascinating about this show, the experience of watching it, is, it has a through line of beauty in its aesthetic design that runs through it. And yet I find myself watching and paying attention to the story and not going, oh, look at that interesting thing in the background. And oh, what about this? And I'm curious, Amanda, if you can talk a little bit about that experience of how sort of like world building and decorating for the universe of Star Wars differs so much from like sort of conventional decoration that you may do on other projects.
I can. So when we started trying to fit into the timeline of where Mandalorian went with the trilogies and what our language was supposed to be, we had a meeting with Jon Favreau and talked about where we were going to take this. And it was really following the look and the style of how they did A New Hope. And that language was found items. It was creating that whole world without building everything, without, designing it to the point where it became this sci-fi. It definitely created its own language as they found things, brought them in, built them into this look. So when we took this one on, we were like, okay, as Doug mentioned, you use about 60% real world items, and then you mix in this next batch. And as we were designing the Star Wars language on those items, it was finding found items. It was, what can we do to kludge items together, paint them in a way, and kind of stay with this look that New Hope had created. Once we got started on that, we created a Star Wars language that we've tried to run through all the Mandalorians. We run that into Boba Fett. Not quite the same when we were doing the next series with Ahsoka, because that has a little bit of a different feel to it. But I think the consistency is what helps in that if the items have the same look, the same language, then you're kind of used to them in the background and they're not jumping and standing out. And I think there is that kind of underlining feel. So when you're watching it, you are watching the story, but the background isn't bumping that it's wrong, but it's also not bumping that it's overly sci-fi or something like that.
I mean, to add to that, I'm glad you said that, Jeannie, because, one of the things that I learned from George was he said that, what he wants, his goal after an audience sees Star Wars is that you can ask them, what was that set like? And they shouldn't be able to remember it. They just remember that it felt real and they were more into the drama and the story. And one of the funny things is that I remember early on, as I was designing sets for George, it was crazy because I would, literally try to figure out every little thing, make it beautiful so that it looked like a cohesive set. And George said, no, that's absolutely wrong, because you don't have any sense of personality of the person that's living there, because no one lives like that. That looks like a set that was manufactured by someone who's just, an interior designer. No one's like that. In fact, somebody's real place has sort of all this eclectic stuff, things that they've collected from their lifetime. So it's a jumble of stuff that really goes to inform the person that's living there. And that completely transformed the way I kind of approach these environments and these sets. And what I love about this process is that Amanda takes that to a whole new level. I mean, all the individual elements, even though they're found elements, they do have a sense of history, and I can kind of see where she's going with it. And what's wonderful is that it creates this veneer where it's this tapestry of background set decoration that completely informs, whoever is inheriting that environment. And yet we're not drawing attention to it. Even though I love that stuff and I love to geek out and we can all sit there and point to all these cool things, that's not their goal. I mean, that's, the fans really want to just get into the story. The fun, geeky stuff is for us.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I do love about this universe is there's so much of an aspect of things being handcrafted. I know, having spent some time in sort of like sci-fi and superhero sort of worlds, a lot of the stuff that we wind up manufacturing has a kind of machine perfection to it. And there's a grittiness to Star Wars, I think, that's really appealing and makes everything is like it's been touched by something, it's been scraped against something, it's fallen over and been picked up. And I don't know, it does put it at I think a closer relationship with the viewer, so that there is a familiarity to it, and it's lovely. I'm curious, are there any moments during the current season where you may have featured something that you're interested in talking about, or something that really excited you, an aspect of the world that the characters are visiting, that any of you cares to touch on?
Yeah, there are actually quite a few. I mean, one of the fun things about doing long form series is that we can actually see not only the characters evolve and do their story arc, but we can see the environments and the sets do the same thing. And so, like, Navarro is a terrific example. We saw that in season 1 as this sort of almost like a gangster town, very run down. And then slowly through season 2 and season 3, it starts to become revitalized. And Grief Karga, who takes over it, starts to turn it into a sort of a family community. And so you can see the transformation in terms of the materials becoming a little bit more vibrant, areas being cleaned up. And all the set decoration in terms of the market streets have now been transformed. Whereas before it was this sort of, back alley sort of market town. Now it's more, in the center, front and center for the townsfolk. And you can see that progression. And I love that because, maybe the audience may never, identify or recognize that. But for us, we can see the environments. If you see the whole series, you can see them transform.
So the image that we're seeing currently looks like we have a back lot with blue screen extensions.
Yeah, that's on our small back lot. We've got a tiny back lot. And some of these pieces are actually leftovers from season 1. And combined with new builds, just like you would have with a town being rebuilt. And I think this is sort of final dressing, but some of those pieces were pretty beaten up. So they've got the sign, genuine signs of repair as we go along. And then this sat for a little while and got aged by the environment kind of nicely as well. We do keep sets anticipating returning to the story locations, and they naturally get aged in the backlot scene dock. So Navarro, we've still got some of this, anticipating whether we're going to come back there or not, which I don't know, or I'm not at liberty to say. But that's kind of the way. And John, favors that kind of approach too, just sort of hanging on to things and seeing if we can use them again for the economy of it.
I mean, one of the things that excites me in design and decoration are just the details, like, the bits of hardware that are kludged onto the sides of buildings and how thoughtfully done that is. And it adds another dimension of reality. And Amanda, maybe you can talk a little bit about the challenges of preparing for dressing a whole back lot of buildings with those sorts of details, and what's involved with that.
It's interesting what we would call Star Wars infrastructure, because we know if you're going to do a backlot and it's, present day, we know what you're getting. You're getting your traffic lights, your Cobra heads, you're getting your electrical boxes, your standpipes. So we have what our normal look is. And we try and take that on any of these Star Wars sets and go, okay, well, what is the function? So if you were doing like a backlot, we know we need the power, the water, your electricity, your what we call vapor towers. So there's the same exact item that we'd be using in the backlot, and we just have identified it as a Star Wars version. I think it's important, and I think that's part of the realism to it. It's just taking what is normally there and just tweaking it so it looks like it belongs in this universe. Ultimately, on all the sets, I think that's what's really important, is it's your everyday normal stuff, but made differently.
And that's the really good point in terms of, sort of the design, like in this photo here in the street. You'll notice that there's a lot of very familiar set dressing in terms of awnings and light fixtures and stuff. But if you look closely, the stanchions are slightly different. They've been tweaked and they're a different material. And that's that 20% that will take it and elevate it into Star Wars, because it's that, that sense of something that looks odd, but it's very familiar. So you recognize it, but it feels different.
I mean, I'm looking at details like, how exotic the things are that are available in the market. And I go, what's the level of manufacturing that has to happen? Like, are you sculpting exotic fruits and vegetables that wind up, or do you just have to source like things that our audience is largely unfamiliar with?
It's really both. It's funny when we keep talking about this, like 60-80% real and the rest is manufactured. It almost covers the basis on that, because if you're looking at what's on that vendor cart right now, it's a lot of sourcing different looking things. Some are actual foods, some are just shapes. And then we did sculpt, pull more molds, and create their own fruits. So it's a mixture.
I think there's Mellaroons in here, which are a story point. I think the baby grabs one, and that was something that was hung over from Book of Boba Fett, where we developed a fruit, the Mellaroon. Yeah, those guys there, and so those are mixed in and very bespoke. And I think they went through some design iterations. So that amount of detail, and yet right next to it is some beautiful thing that Amanda found.
I think also another thing that grounds us in a kind of reality that's more familiar is the marriage of materials too. I mean, we've got these baskets that are woven from more traditional materials, and they're right alongside, things that are machined pieces. And so when you have those things that are functioning as vessels within the same space, I think it sort of, again, it lends that air of familiarity to the viewer, but there is an exotic aspect to it that's like it kind of throws you off a bit. So it's exciting to examine the details and think about. Andrew, what about you? Is there a particular set from the season that excited you that you would care to describe some of that experience?
Sure. The landscape that we saw there is on the surface of Mandalore, and the surface of Mandalore, John's idea for that was that it was a planet that had been blasted so hard with fusion bombs that it actually melted the surface a little bit, kind of like the Trinity site in Nevada, I think, where the early atomic bomb tests were. They found that it was so hot that it actually fused the sand into a new material called trinitite, which had a slight green hue to it. So his concept was that the surface of the Earth, of the planet of Mandalore, got so blasted that we got a crust of this material, which then subsequently fractured and made all of those extraordinary shapes that are in Doug's concept art. So we did all sorts of fun research to try to figure out what that might look like and how it might be made. We got some actual trinitite that you had to use rubber gloves to hold because it was still radioactive. And we got something from my childhood, Kendall mint cake, which in my memory was very much like that. It was a sort of sugary thing. And then the model maker, Jason Mahakian, did all sorts of strange concoctions and cooking and mixing syrups and sugars together to try to understand what this material might be. And eventually our construction coordinator, Steve DeSantis, and Dave Cohen, our mold maker, came up with a solution that was part truck bed liner, part urethane, part this clear stuff that you pour on top of bars to make them shiny. And then Rudy Schaefer, our art director, worked out a strange pattern that you could put these big sheets together in to make the seams not look obvious. So this was a real science project to try to figure out what this was, but we really wanted to get something that looked like the concept art, because the concept art did the same thing as the Mandalorian's helmet. It made these beautiful reflections that reflected the LED wall and everything that was going on out there. So we eventually got a material that worked well and was flexible enough to use for a number of different sets. And the John Risso paint department just came up with some wonderful ways of texturing it to get the colors right. And a lot of samples that were taken into the volume and put up against the wall to check whether the reflection of the virtual matched the physical and vice versa. And in cases like that, by the way, if you're trying to match two very unique materials, one on the LED wall and one a physical one, that's the way we do it. We make one and we scan it and put it in the content, and then put them next to each other and see how they look on camera. And then we can adjust either one to make it match the other. And you should talk about that, Amanda, because that's a large part of your process too.
Yeah. So again, part of that's the seamless connection between what is on the screens and what we bring in practically is what makes this so important. And color is definitely part of it. So again, if we have to change our paint hues, we can adjust. We were just in there not that long ago trying to figure out, the difference between kind of a coppery brass with this green. And it just makes a huge difference that needs to kind of be spot on for that connection to work. And we have found not only just in color, but also, the items, if we have 2 items in practical, and then you have more in the digital, it really just connects your eye, and nothing stops you. You just kind of see right through it. In season 1, I think it was our first episode, we had built a dock, and the dock went into the screen, and then the dock continued on. And we had some dressing in the practical, a little bit out on the dock as it went. And when you stood there, your eye followed, and it was amazing how well this technology works.
I have to say, for Mandalore, part of the charm and the challenge really is that we're creating this very surreal environment that could look false very quickly. And the homework that Andrew was just highlighting, for the team in terms of making this a real material so that it actually looked real, it went a long way to kind of making this authentic. The other thing too is that, when you're creating sort of fantastic environments like this, you do have to sort of ground it in something that we can relate, because no one has ever seen a planet made of trinitite. And that's impossible. So our closest equivalent was an ice field in the Arctics. And so when you kind of tie the two together, you can kind of see that it's kind of familiar, and you can understand, okay, I can get how that's formed. But yet when you see the material itself, it's something different. It's not ice. And that's where I think that's the special sauce in terms of designing and executing for Star Wars, is that you want that exotic quality, but then you ground it in something that we're kind of familiar with.
You know, one of the things that is just so lovely about this season too is sort of the connection of the lead character, where he's sort of brought back to his tribe, and then the tribe is restored to their homeland. And so there's like sort of like new emotional layers that are explored in the story of this season. I think that the way that the story is told and how the production design and set decoration support that is so commendable. I mean, the beauty of these shots as these characters are walking along the surface of this planet, and then the ship as it arrives. I mean, the ship is so wonderful. The idea that something that flies but also has sails on it seems like such a peculiar, anomalous sort of idea. And yet, I think as viewers, we're just so willing to accept it because you've been able to present it in such a believable and kind of romantic fashion, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, the landscape was actually, playing into the whole idea of ice sheets as sort of the foundation for Mandalore. Those were ice skiffs, those ice runners. But they're small. They're usually like 1 or 2 person, speeders, or not speeders, but, like skiffs that go over the ice for racing. And so we literally took that idea and just scaled it up to be a size of an ocean liner. And that's the fun, because you have something that's really based in reality, and yet we're treating it very differently.
It's lovely. Amanda, I wanted to ask you about something, because I've had a little bit of I've had to contend with this with my own stuff, but there are things that are available to us as set decorators that can help us add more dimension to the set. And usually those things are like, you're longing for shapes to present on a set that might offer a different kind, like a different kind of textural experience. For example, in a conventional setting, if you have like lots of hard-edged objects or something, you may want to soften some pieces of the set with the use of plants, or even things like stacks of paperwork on a desk. And I know that in the universe of Star Wars, there are strict limitations on those kinds of things that are available to you. So I'm curious, how do you find those kinds of relief? Like, what serves as the right kind of textural stuff so that you can stay within the rules of the universe?
That's an interesting conundrum that we deal with a lot. The note paper, when you have an office space, we did this season, we did cubicles. And when that first came up, I'm like, how in the world are we going to make Star Wars cubicles? And what can you put in there?
Okay, sorry for interrupting, but for a second, help the viewer understand what the rule is around paper.
My rule that I understand is there is no paper. Like, I do know there's some ancient Jedi books, and I think that might be the only paper that's around.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's this quirky thing. It's no paper, it's tablets or data pads, but no physical paper.
Yeah, so it presents a challenge. Yeah,
it's a challenge, but it's been kind of interesting to see what the workarounds are with that. So we know you can have tablets. We ended up getting our hands on what I like to call it just like the tablet case. So without having to consider it your notebook without paper in it. And so now you've got that shape that you would stack up and use as paper. But to make it more Star Wars, we would, we added a little gack to it, or we put a couple little LED lights in it. But then you can go back to, okay, here you go. And you can stack them up and you can have them in your office spaces. And that was kind of what we did across the board. Every set we were in, when you couldn't lean on normal layers of items that we do use to kind of fill the environment and make it look real, you just have to go, okay, kind of what I was explaining about when I was in the streets is what would it have been and what is your Star Wars version of that? And it's been really fun to create. Sean Ginvin, the lead man, and he has put together an amazing crew of people that kind of have taken that on. Like, okay, this is what we know we're after, and I can go get a bunch of shape. And everyone's very proud of being able to work on this job, but also really put their own talent and abilities. And you can start with something that looks so plain, and by the time it has gone through the different departments between our prop shops and our the set deck crew and our paint, it looks just totally different. And it's always amazing where it starts to how it ends. And it's just to the talent of that crew. And I'm very thankful to have them all.
Well, you know, I have so much respect for you, your crew. I mean, all the craftspeople and all the craftsmanship that's on display in this show. A special hats off to the property department. I know that they make a major contribution too, and your prop master Josh. And so I'm curious, Amanda, is there a particular moment or a set in the season that excited you, or something that you would care to discuss?
It's funny, I look at it as a whole, and I think I do on most projects. I kind of take them all on individually, and part of it is making sure we connect them all and we keep me in that universal language. It was interesting going to Mandalore. I know we had touched on the surface. That one was a little tricky because it was a bombed out place that had so much history that people know what it looks like. And you had to then create the damaged version of that. And that was a challenge. It was a challenge to make sure you kept what the history was, understand what you were trying to create, and then give the textual stuff to shoot through and make sure it all looked right and connected, and yet it's still somewhat destroyed. So it's not like going into a set and making sure it looks beautiful. You really had to create this whole underworld space and make it look real. So that one was challenging. I think in the end it worked, but that was rough along the way to try and get to that spot to make sure it tied into the history of what Mandalore was.
One of the really fun things about season 3 was that we actually got to sort of go underground, underneath the trinitite surface, to find out what Moff Gideon has been up to all these years. And we discovered there's an Imperial base there that he's been secretly manufacturing. And it's a really interesting design challenge because we want to imply that there's an Imperial presence. And so we pulled in a lot of the Imperial form language in terms of the doors, the shape languages of the window mullions. But then we want to mix it in with sort of the raw, ravaged version of Mandalore. So we start to create these hallways, these internal sort of networks of chambers where you actually see the Imperial buttresses, but then right next to them are this raw trinitite, stonework. And it started to create a really interesting look that started to give a sense of, okay, well, this thing has existed here for a while, but then Moff Gideon came in and started to build upon it and start to really build it out. And we kept that same sort of angular quality of those classic Imperial hallways, and we actually magnified that. And the really fun part of this whole environment was the hangar itself. So we took that angular hallway and blew it up to be the size of a hangar. And then because we were underground, we wanted to play into the motif of, okay, this is a cave, a manufactured cave, but it's a cave. So how do we sort of reinforce that emotion? And we thought, well, how about if we had the TIE defenders actually hung up in the ceilings like bats? And so when you look at the whole thing, you start to get all these little cues that start to inform what this environment is. And I love the idea that, when we can create a set where you have all these little elements that are not necessarily explained, but they go to inform the bigger picture of what the whole infrastructure should be. This is the Mandalorian encampment on Navarro.
Yes. The Mandalorian encampment. Let's hear a little bit about this. The tent design is fantastic. I'm so interested in how much of these you had to fabricate. Amanda, why don't you talk about this a little bit?
So this design, again, it was an interesting one because you're trying to create places. In reality, you're like, where did these units come from? Where they've been storing all these tents, so you kind of trying to come up with the reality of what you're looking at and then try to get the visual look in the end. Doug's illustrations were beautiful, and the combination of fabrics and reused materials And that kind of aged item, I think, just leads to this Star Wars look. In the end, we made the front half of the large tent. So it was enough for the armorer to be able to get in and out. And then all the close-up shots by the door were all real. And then I believe we made 3 or 4 of the smaller tents. And you can kind of see, like, we really follow the illustrations when we are trying to kind of work off of that. So we respect what's coming and what everyone has created. And then we just try and add and give it that little bit of extra life and realism. Like, what would the Mandalorians carry? What are their tools? What do they use? How do they eat? This is another one. It's like, what do you bring to a campsite? Consider this a military campsite. You would have the same situation. You know, they have to be able to eat. They have to be able to pack their gear. So it's, what are the Star Wars versions of all that?
And I like to highlight, I mean, that tent in particular, that image, it really speaks to what Amanda did, was to, figure out, like what she said, to make sense of the design. The designs of the tents were based on yurts, thinking that the Mandalorians were kind of outcasts, they're nomads. But then what we did was we changed the material so that instead of bones and sort of wood to fasten them, we had steel and cables. And then, but the terrific thing is that in this image here, you start to get that sense of history. Like, okay, well, that makes sense. Those containers on the wall, maybe they're things that they pulled out of storage. They're food containers or heaters or something. And so it starts to create this tapestry that starts to explain, okay, the Mandalorian lifestyle, that they're nomads, that they're outcasts. And, and so from a global view, you can see that, okay, they're nomads because these are tents and they kind of reference yurts. But then when you dive into the details, this is what I love about what Amanda does, is that she really brings it to life and makes it very real.
Yeah, again, it's that seamless marriage of something that's real and familiar, like there's a tribal aspect to it, mixed with these sci-fi machined pieces. And I think whenever you start to juxtapose those things, it tells a story and puts you in a particular mood that's so unique to Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
So bravo. It's funny, as I was looking at that tent facade too, I was thinking, like, the design of that would be really perfectly at home in the first Star Wars movie, like I would believe it in that context. And so I think that's a testament to the level of skill on display.
Yes. No, in fact, it's funny that you say that, because that was some of our early foundations, were the Tusken Sand Raider tents. But they had bone and leather, and so we kind of took that away and kind of made it more Mandalorian, a little bit more high tech, because the Mandalorians are more technology based.
As we've been going through all these sets where you're trying to get the realism and the Star Wars version, vehicles are a very different story when it comes to that, and they're a challenge of their own. It's been so much fun trying to kind of create these spaces with, the world of the blinky lights and all the panels, and building out the seating. And there's just so much that goes into these ships. But they're so much fun to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the keys of designing sort of interiors for spaceships is to capture the personality of whoever's inhabiting it. And so in the Gauntlet ship, you can see that a lot of the form language of the shapes of the seats, the details, they all kind of reflect the armor themselves. And so you can kind of like automatically, know that when you're looking at the interior, it's a Mandalorian cockpit. And then what's really fun is that, Amanda brings like all those other details of all the buttons, because we have to make it real. I mean, once we get the sense of that is, what the aesthetic is, we do have to make it functional in some ways to, for the performers. And when all that comes together, it creates a really interesting personality that's very distinct, because, we treat all of our vehicles as if they're characters with different personalities. And it's very important that they do have a different look. So the Gauntlet interior, for example, was very different than the Millennium Falcon interior.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a real testament to the design on display when we transfer between different vehicles and different environments. The idea that you preserve a character within a particular setting really helps the viewer transition from one space to the other, because we've all had the experience where we've been watching a story on another show or in a film, and we don't actually have any frame of reference for understanding where we are as a viewer. It's like, where did we just cut to? And so I love the clarity of the storytelling on display here, because there's such unique characters with, especially within all of the aircraft and starcraft, that it's like you kind of go, okay, now I know where we are, and I know who our characters are, and it really helps.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you say that, because that means that we did our job right, because that is really critical. When we design our sets, literally, we have to be able to recognize, who owns the ship, what is the personality within 2 or 3 seconds, and that's filmmaking. You're not going to be there to explain what the design is. So thank you for recognizing that, because there a lot of hard work went into making that, look easy.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask, because it looks like we're getting close on time, but I'd like to ask, is there anything that any of you would care to touch on that we haven't regarding your season, or is there a special shout out to anyone that you'd like to mention? Feel free.
I mean, for the set decoration department, we've been able to put together a team that has basically stayed together for all these seasons, and across the board with Sean Ginnivan, and we've got gang bosses, with painter Doug Hawthorne, and our prop shop crew. Just as a whole, I would just like to thank that department for everything they give.
I just want to say, I'm just so honored to work with Andrew and with Amanda and with Josh. It's just such a terrific team. I mean, we've gone through so much together, and season 3 was by far our biggest so far. And, with a compressed schedule and budget, and the fact that, Jon Favreau keeps elevating the aspirational bar, and we're still, meeting it, is, I think, speaks to the team, the strength of the team, and the creativity of everybody.
Well, here's to many, many more seasons of it. You guys do such fantastic work, and it's really such a pleasure to watch. I want to thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and to see you again too, and hopefully I'll get to see you again soon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gene.
Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Inside the Set with Set Decor. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website, setdecor.com.